You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 330 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about an agreement that Secretary of Energy Rick Perry is working on to sell Saudi Arabia nuclear technology. I have updates on the Korean peace process, and Donald Trump is apparently going to be meeting with the South Korean president soon, and news about what the U.S. withdrawal in Syria is going to look like, and hopefully we'll be seeing some troops come home soon. Please take the time to share the show or recommend it to a friend. The best place to find the show online is at the Libertarian Institute, where the show and my daily news roundup are featured on the homepage. The URL is libertarianinstitute.org. I do update current events on the show, so the best way to follow the show and get the most out of it is to listen to most of the episodes, so make sure you're subscribing to the show somewhere, whether it's iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, BitShow. The show should be at all those podcatchers and pretty much up anywhere anybody watches or listens to podcasts. And then if you want to donate to the show, you could do that at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. First up on today's show, I just wanted to say that the more I look at how the Democratic race is going to go for 2020 here, it may be actually kind of interesting. At first looking at it, I wasn't too excited because in part, I kind of come from the Republican side, and so the Democrats always just kind of seem like boring people from a spectrum of Hillary Clinton to Elizabeth Warren. But there does seem to be now some maybe real debate for the Democrats on the foreign policy issue for this campaign season. One example is the MoveOn.org asking candidates not to go to the APAC, that's the American Israel Political Action Committee conference. And some candidates, I believe I saw Harris, Sanders, and Warren, all in response to the MoveOn thing, said they weren't going. I'm not sure if other candidates, especially some of the less mainstream ones like Andrew Yang and Tulsi Gabbard attended or maybe weren't invited in the first place. Whereas on the other side that you have a Cory Booker who is apparently texting the president of AIPAC. And so that's going to be a pretty steep difference in what U.S. policy will look like towards Israel, and possibly, especially, looking at the current status of the Trump administration, where one place you could say, not that the U.S. was doing anything great for the Palestinians under Obama, but certainly our stance on the issue now is far more, pro-Israeli state, very critical of the Palestinians, blaming everything on them. All the solutions had to be Palestinian fits first, and then the Israels will, stop punishing the Palestinians. Another example I think we're going to see here is a split I see in part from an example of the Washington Post report that Mike Morell, a former CIA chief, put together a collection of reports, like 37-page report, all about the foreign policy threats to the United States. And one of the specific ones mentioned was that we're not going to be able to get along with Russia and, the terrible Russian influence. And so it seems like they're offering that to the Democratic establishment and the Democratic candidates to form like a 2020 line on Russia, that, this is kind of the acceptable position that the intelligence community agrees to. Because somehow, we have Russia in the age of Trump scenario here for the Democrats, where Russia's just getting away with everything and having all this malign influence around the world, versus an article that Danny Sjursen writes at antiwar.com. I'll link to this one on the show notes page, where Danny goes through and explains that, like, hey, if you're a Democrat, you want to win 2020, you got to take these anti-regime change positions, you got to find a way to get along with Russia. And these are things that you see out of candidate Tulsi Gabbard. And so I saw an interview with Tulsi Gabbard. Michael Tracey interviewed her. I guess he's got a new show or something. And the interview is great. It's like an hour and a half, so it's kind of long. But Tulsi does a really good job of answering questions and criticisms about herself and her positions. Tulsi has done some brave things, like going and visiting Bashar al-Assad, I believe in 2017. At a time when the U.S. is ready to bomb the guy, she's willing to go over there and have a conversation and try to understand what the position of Assad and the Syrian people who are loyal to and supportive of him are, and understanding that the opposition to Assad was Al-Qaeda and ISIS, largely. There's some Free Syrian Army people in there who are probably a little bit less radical, but, largely the opposition, especially the armed portion of the opposition that was taking territory and fighting Assad's army, it's Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And I'm going to link to that interview with Tulsi and Michael Tracey in the show notes page, just because as a libertarian, I thought this was kind of an interview I was waiting for, something where she, isn't talking about, kind of leftism and universal basic income a whole lot. She's, when the subject comes up, she's like, I'm kind of aware of it. So it's very libertarian friendly. You're not going to hear a whole bunch of progressive stuff in there. And overall, I thought it was a good one. And so maybe this is a good one to share among the libertarian community. Speaking of Michael Tracey and shifting the subject now to Russiagate a little bit, he had a pretty good Twitter thread. And I thought this was important about Hillary Clinton's role in promoting the Russiagate narrative. On the show, I've been much more critical of the kind of left-wing media, MSNBC, CNN, and all the other even more progressive outlets that really followed and took this Russiagate line and accused anyone who was against it, whether it was somebody like Glenn Greenwald or Michael Tracey or somebody, on the right, just, being Trump apologists. And then, the intelligence people like Brennan, Clapper, Comey. But Hillary Clinton deserves a lot of the blame here, too. It was her campaign that I think really started to craft and push this whole Russiagate narrative. And then she continued it well after, she had been defeated in the race because she was a poor candidate. So that Twitter thread will also be linked in the show notes page. And, now that we have the Mueller report out, we know that nobody in the Trump presidency was going to be indicted for it, and there's no proof of Russian collusion. It's going back and kind of breaking down all the lies that we've worked to debunk over the past 2.5 years. And there's been just excellent interviews coming out all over the place. A couple that I want to mention here was Aaron Mate was on the Scott Horton show. They do a really good job of breaking down like that very beginning, started 2016 into the first half of 2017 portion of the Russiagate narrative, and just how poorly crafted this whole thing was from the beginning, and how every single kind of story that's been set up to kind of further the narrative that there's all these Trump ties to Russia are really debunked time and time again. It's very rare to find one that really even remotely stands up anymore. I thought a couple highlights from the show are Aaron's point, and I really only hear him make this, is that Hillary Clinton, on the past on the show, I portrayed it, was an idiot and didn't go to Wisconsin and Michigan to campaign and then end up losing critical states because of it. When he points out that she wasn't going based on strategy, because if she went, she was going to become more unlikable because she was so terrible that going and talking to people in those states may turn people off of her. So I think that, even adds further to the narrative that this obviously wasn't a Russian plot, much less Russian collusion, that it was Hillary Clinton being a poor candidate that wound up with Trump winning the election. Even going all the way back to the emails showing that it was the Clinton campaign that encouraged the media to promote Donald Trump because they thought he would be easy to beat in the general election. Now, another point that Scott and Aaron both seem to agree on here, and I just want to say it because I may have overstated the position in the past on the show, is the analysis from Bill Binney with Vips on whether it was a leak or a hack that exposed, I believe it's the DNCC emails. Ray McGovern, who I believe is the founder of Vips, or, one of the, really spokesperson for that organization, veteran intelligence professionals for Sandy, and Bill Binney have firmly stood behind their analysis that they have metadata of the breach that shows that it was downloaded onto a thumb drive locally and not taken and downloaded across the internet, which means that, somebody stuck a thumb drive into the computer. I guess that doesn't mean it couldn't have been like a Russian spy or something. Black Widow breaks into the DNCC and sticks a thumb drive in and takes them and sends them back to the motherland. I suppose that's possible too, but that kind of evidence, especially coupled with the fact that you had Craig Murray on the Scott Horton show, who's associated with WikiLeaks, saying that he met the source of the DNCC leaks and that it was not Russia. And so, it suggests that it would be like some kind of DNCC employee, maybe disgruntled about, as the emails show, the DNC stole the election from Bernie Sanders and gave it to Hillary Clinton. They gave him heard the debate questions. It was very intentional, the way they did everything to make sure that Hillary Clinton beat Bernie Sanders. But both Scott and Aaron aren't quite as convinced about the metadata. Not that they think that Ray or Bill are wrong, just that, they're not quite as convinced. And I guess the more I look over and review that's probably should be my position too, just based on my understanding of the evidence, which isn't very great because it's super technical. There's also an interview, Joanne Leon, Around the Empire with Matt Taibbi. I discussed his great article on the show. In that interview, they go through even more. And so I'm just going to link to that one, the show notes page, because I'm already running a little long on my discussion on Russiagate here. I want to have a couple updates on WikiLeaks here. One story and one interview. The story is Elizabeth Voss, who does the Unity for Julian visuals every Friday with Joe Loria, and is a great advocate for WikiLeaks, wrote an article for Consortium News explaining that it's now been 1 year that Julian Assange has been unable to really connect with the outside world, that he can't post on Twitter or anything like that. His, I believe, access to the internet and visitors is pretty limited. And then this is even further shown when Cassandra Fairbanks, I guess, traveled to the UK and attempted to meet with Julian Assange at the Ecuadorian embassy. She talks about how she was followed by a man taking photos of her as she was, preparing for an interview inside the embassy, how she was treated while she was there, including being locked in a room from the outside, not being able to have a private conversation with Julian in any way. Everything was going to be included, and a lot of arguing between Julian and the embassy staff. If you're interested in more details, like I said, I'll link to an interview that Fairbanks did actually on the Unity for Julian show, where she breaks down her whole experience. Is very interesting. You could tell that, I think she was like, oh my God, this was really crazy the way everything was unfolded and just the level around it. And she's actually been there to, interview Julian in the past. But all this makes it even more important that we're advocating for WikiLeaks, free speech, First Amendment, journalism, access to information, the ability to spread information and, take leaked classified documents and expose that information to the rest of the people so they can make decisions about what their government is secretly doing. And one of the reasons that's important is because you have things like this happening, where Secretary of Energy Rick Perry has apparently signed at least 6 secret agreements with Saudi Arabia to sell them nuclear technology. Now, it's been a while since I've talked about this on the show, but the first time I did, this was the stat. Saudi Arabia was advocating to get some civilian nuclear technology, which can't really complain about a country wanting to have a more diverse way of getting power and electricity to their people, and nuclear power could be a cheap and efficient way to do that. And all countries, in Saudi Arabia and Iran are included, are entitled to those civilian programs. But the United States want to sell Saudi Arabia a program, a very specific type, with a 1-2-3 agreement, like they did with the Emirates. And I'm not sure, how similar to what the Iranians have put on them, but basically the way the 1-2-3 agreement would work is it would prevent Saudi Arabia from having the capabilities of getting enough nuclear material to make a bomb. And so it's like kind of a safeguarded civilian program that the United States would be selling them. Saudi Arabia rejected this. And then there's been some negotiations going on between the Trump administration and Saudi Arabia since. Some concerning factors here for me are, I don't think Rick Perry's all that bright. At one time, he wanted to be the guy that got rid of the Department of Energy and famously couldn't remember it and leaned to, my man Ron Paul for help. But now he's in charge of it, is in nuclear negotiations with the Saudis. I really don't believe, and maybe I'm really wrong on this, and in which case I'll have to apologize to Rick Perry, that he probably has the understanding of nuclear energy and the nuclear weapons process to really negotiate a solid thing with Saudi Arabia here. Hopefully he has good advisors, but man, it seems like he could really get duped on this one. Also, the Trump administration has the Jared Kushner connection with Saudi Arabia, but has, been unwaveringly favorable to the Saudis throughout this whole thing, including continuing to stand up for Saudi Arabia's brutal genocidal war on Yemen and basically overlooking the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in the Turkish consulate. And so just for now, I'll say that the announcement of these agreements are concerning to me. I think it's a story that it's important that we all follow and pay attention to. And hopefully, there's some good journalism coming out here, getting our hands on the information of exactly what the United States is looking at selling Saudi Arabia at this point. Now, another story on Saudi Arabia that I actually think is getting probably overhyped is this one from the Daily Beast. Now, I guess credit to Upfront, they put it in the headline, and the guy who writes the article is Upfront, that he works for Jeff Bezos, and Jeff Bezos gave him basically an unlimited budget to carry out an investigation into how the tabloid that ends up leaking, his affair and then threatening to leak some embarrassing photos of him got all that information. Now, the claim from the Bezos funded report is that Saudi Arabia somehow discovered, and without providing really any evidence, or at least none that I could see or understand, claimed that Saudi Arabia got a hold of Bezos' private communications, email, phone records, text records, so somehow got into his phone, is the way it would seem to me, and then passed the information that he was having an affair on to the tabloid. The tabloid then took that information and went and solicited people in an attempt to get them to, find the information in a different way. That way they could run it. Because I guess the Saudis, it would look really bad from the journalists, or, a tabloid, I don't want to call them journalists really, but it would look really bad for them to take the information from Saudi Arabia when they illegally stole it from Bezos in the first place. And that's the narrative put forward. The circumstantial evidence provided in the article is, of course, the Khashoggi murdering, Bezos owning the Washington Post, which Khashoggi wrote for, and they've stood up for their journalists in the wake of his murder, which people should be critical of Saudi Arabia for. Don't disagree with that at all. But that's one of the reasons. And then they talk about, the kingdom wanting to boycott Amazon and other things in a result here. And so, they do, like I said, paint these circumstantial ties between the two groups. But when it comes in far as technical evidence, which I think is what you would need to see, because it really, as I was reading this whole thing, it shocked me that the richest man in the world can't secure his text messages from the Saudis. Maybe the NSA sweeps up everything, but it really seems to me like if, he's texting his mistress, that's something that he should be able to keep private from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Anyways, it's gained a lot of spin, and I know a lot of, and one of my natural reactions to this was to be sympathetic towards the story because of the Khashoggi connection and everything like that. But looking back at it a second time and reading the evidence, I throw this in the skeptical category. Until either more information comes out, or if nothing else does, I don't think you could believe it. All right, some stuff going on the southern border with immigration. We have Trump basically threatening to close the border with Mexico because he says the Mexican government isn't doing enough to stop the kind of migrant caravans that are coming through Mexico. Now, most of the migrants themselves aren't Mexico. They're from what they call the Northern Triangle, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And Trump has said that he's cutting off aid programs to these countries now because he even accuses them of facilitating the caravans coming through Mexico and everything. There's some things happening in Venezuela. There's an arrival of Russian military planes and troops to that country, which sparked quite a bit of outrage from the United States. Now, of course, it's almost kind of a Syria-esque situation, I think, where Russia has a long-standing agreement with the, government of Venezuela and has been supportive of that government, has ties with that government. And so just like the United States deploys military planes and troops to countries where we are supportive of that government, that's something that happens. So I'm not quite sure why there's so much offense to this move. But, the U.S. wants to carry on regime change operations. So, of course, everybody like the Marco Rubios and the intelligence community and the mainstream media and the hawks like John Bolton and Donald Trump are making a big deal out of it. In fact, Donald Trump has said that it's unacceptable. I've seen American officials call it a reckless escalation. And Trump said that all options are on the table to get the Russian troops out. Now, I really don't think that even Donald Trump is crazy enough to believe that would be a good idea to try to evict the Russians from Venezuela with the American military, but, increase in sanctions and stuff like that. And of course, really don't have any business telling the Russians that they can't be there. All right, the other thing is that the U.S. sanctions on Venezuela oil have been in place for over a month now, so we're getting some kind of tallies on what effect they have had. According to the Reuters article I read, at one point, the average for the past 3 months before the sanctions was 1.5 million barrels a day was being exported by Venezuela. However, once the sanctions took place, that number dropped to 920,000 barrels per day. So, that's a pretty significant decrease and will no doubt harm the Venezuelan economy and the Venezuelan people. It probably won't be enough to overthrow the Maduro regime, and in fact, the people will dig in, and if the government continues to get worse and the economy continues to get worse between the commie policies in that country, the U.S. sanctions will be a great and easy excuse for Maduro to use. The U.S. is even threatening now to put on secondary sanctions against other companies, globally, whether they're in Europe or India. They're facilitating these exports of Venezuelan oil. And so, we could see this number cut even more, and that's going to be even worse for the Venezuelan people. All right, so news from the Hanoi summit coming out. Basically, this seems to me to be a confirmation of kind of the take that has unfolded on this show in the past. But we have an official letter that Donald Trump gave to Kim Jong-un. We have the English version. There's a Korean version. But basically lays out what Donald Trump was demanding from North Korea and in turn for sanctions relief. And it was the complete denuclearization. Basically, Trump's demand was back to the John Bolton Libyan Style denuclearization. They give up all their weapons of mass destruction programs, their nukes, chemical weapons, biological weapons, inspections to ensure that they have, closing nuclear facilities, ending enrichment capabilities, getting rid of the ICBM, the launchers, all the sites, any of the nuclear facilities that we believe are too close to being able to develop a nuclear weapons program, and then we'll give the sanctions relief. Now, it was very interesting that this is the offer that Donald Trump put forward to Kim Jong-un, because the signs leading up to the summit, and the reason that I had expressed optimism about it, is that Donald Trump understood that this option was absolutely not going to work for the North Koreans. The best reason is because that this is the agreement that Colonel Gaddafi signed on to as head of Libya, and then ended up being killed 7 years later by a U.S.-backed NATO air support campaign of mostly Al-Qaeda ground troops in Libya. And then this is the ideal the Iranians signed on to that the Americans backed out of and then re-sanctioned that country. But also, this just isn't the way that diplomacy should work. Their mutual trust should be established that way. You're improving relationships with the country. You establish methods of communications to resolve any problems that show up. And, you could achieve real peace and progress. So if this is the long-standing U.S. position, then, maybe this Korean peace process has run its course. Now, the good news and the reason why I'm not completely optimistic yet is the president of South Korea, who, I've kind of said I think he's the hero of this Korean peace process so far, Moon Jae-in, is coming to Washington on April 10th to visit with Donald Trump. And he's a real lifelong diehard believer in, Korean peace and finding a way to end the Korean War and establishing deeper relations between the two countries. And so hopefully he's either able to talk Donald Trump into something or to say, kind of, listen, Trump, I'm going to go back to Korea and we're going to have better relationship with the country just to our north because they're the Korean people too. And, what are you going to do? Put your army in between us? I don't think so. A story I talked about on the show last week, and I was kind of saying that I'm not quite sure the whole story yet, but we had the break-in of the North Korean embassy in Madrid, where about 10 intruders come in, tie up the embassy staff, take the embassy head into a separate room, do something, and then leave. They issued 2 arrest warrants, one for the group leader and one for someone else. One of these guys is a South Korean citizen. The other one is a Mexican citizen, I believe of Korean descent, but was living in the United States at the time. And they're both apparently part of this group of North Korean dissidents. According to the warrant for their arrest that the Spanish court put out, the leader of the group, after talking to the Korean delegation head in Madrid, then traveled to the United States, met with somebody from the FBI, and we don't know what since. And so far, the FBI has denied ever talking to this guy or I think really knowing who he is. So it adds some more mystery to the story. It's starting, I guess, to reveal it some as we now have this, at least Spanish government feeling that they know who was behind the break-in. On Saturday, we had the 1-year anniversary of the Land Day or the Great Return March in Gaza. This is the day where the people go to the edge of Gaza, and whether it's the border of Israel, as the IDF claims, or the wall of a prison, as many people in Gaza feel, they went out and protest. Hundreds end up with injuries from tear gas inhalation, others shot with rubber-coated steel bullets, at least 3 people, including 2 teenagers, killed. So again, another terrible day in violent protest. I think the violence was, kind of far short of what it was last year. 40,000 people end up showing up to this protest. And of course, all over on Twitter, all I see is IDF propaganda of how, the Palestinians train their babies to be terrorists and all this other stuff. Somebody tried to kill the Afghanistan vice president. This guy is Rashid Dostum, who is a notorious world criminal and has done some brutal and violent things in his past. So I'm sure there's a list of people who would like to kill him, and not just the Taliban. He actually, the day he returned from Afghanistan from exile, ISIS tried to kill him as kind of return rally and ended up killing 14 other people. So, this could be another ISIS attack as well. All right, and then Syria news to end it here. We have a statement from a U.S. official saying that the plan for U.S. withdrawal in Syria is to have it down to about 1,000 troops in early May, and then a 6 months pause on the withdrawal to kind of get an update on the status, and then decisions possibly going down to 400 troops from there. This isn't great. It's a long timeline. Seems like to me that saying 1,000 troops is probably going to be more than 1,000, 1,200 to 1,500 or so. Who knows how many contractors are in Syria to just add to that number. But if we are down to 1,000 by May, that is something. That's less troops than were there before. Although I think the Obama cap was supposed to be 504, so we're still double that. And, there's no congressional authorization for this thing whatsoever. And it's just the most ridiculous thing, but this is the new timeline that we're looking at. Who knows what it'll be in a week from now. But I do want to keep updating on that because I know that, it's a big story. A lot of us are interested and we want to bring the troops home. All right, that'll do it for today. Share the show or recommend it to a friend. LibertarianInstitute.org, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. Twitter is at KYAAALE. Libertarian Union, on Facebook. Immersionnews.com is my website, and then minds.com/immersionnews.